You're live. Okay. All right. Hello and welcome. We're going to dive in here to Jonah chapter 2. Before we get there, we're going to do a bit of review. So here's what we're doing in this Bible study. We're actually doing a Bible study in Jonah. But while we go, we're also going to talk about how to study the Bible while we study the Bible. So thus, the Bible study. And so I want to review real quick some of what we talked about last week about how to study the Bible as we get started. If you've done much Bible study in the past, you might be familiar with a particular method of Bible study called the inductive Bible study. This is basically how I study the Bible, and I'll talk about it a bit more in a second. But an inductive Bible study begins with observations. And I shared this last week. I am more and more convinced, the older I get, that the most significant interpretations, the most significant applications in a Bible study tend to come from the most obvious observations, the sort of little observations we tend to skip if we've spent any amount of time in a church at all. Last week, we talked how even in chapter 1, verse 1, Jonah writes that the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and call out against it, for the evil has come up before me." And we observed together some obvious observations, namely that God speaks and that God speaks to us. These are significant observations, that God cares about evil. He's not indifferent to evil. And we went on and on, paying attention to the most obvious observations, and we're going to continue to do that this evening in Jonah chapter 2. So first, we want to pay attention to the obvious observations. Second, we want to pay attention to repetition. If something is turning up multiple times, it's probably because it's significant. In Jonah chapter 1, one of those examples was there's this one phrase turned up 3 times, that Jonah fled from the presence of God. That's how Jonah described the sin of Jonah, which is a different way than we tend to describe sin, as fleeing from the presence of God. It makes sense if you know your Bible. That's what Adam and Eve did all the way back in Genesis, what was that, chapter 3? They screwed up. They knew it. And what did they do? They hid. This morning I was reading in Job, and this is so fascinating. If you know the story of Job, Satan actually enters the throne room of God and has this conversation with God. And then the language that Job uses is that when he's done having a conversation, what Satan does is he leaves the presence of God. And we saw in Jonah chapter 1 that this is what Jonah did. He fled the presence of God as he headed towards Joppa and then towards Tarshish. We always want to pay attention to repetition. We want to look for connections in the text between key phrases or ideas. We want to pay attention to scene changes. We want to pay attention to action verbs or prepositions, character changes. And then tonight, especially, we want to pay attention to cross-references. As Christians, we believe the Bible to be authoritative on that which it intends to speak. It is infallible on that which it intends to speak. And the best way to interpret the Bible is with the Bible, right? If the Bible is infallible, if it's authoritative, it's not going to contradict itself. And in fact, the Bible references itself over and over and over again. And tonight we're going to see these cross-references, these quotes, where the Bible quotes itself, right? Or a character in the Bible quotes the Bible, can be really helpful in interpretation and application. That is some of what we talked about last week. Of course, we stated the obvious. We ought to pray before we study the Bible. We ask God to reveal himself to us in the text. And what do you know? God has a way of doing that when we ask him to, which of course he does. So where we left off in Jonah had fled the presence of God. God had come to him and said, go to Nineveh. He said, I don't want to go. And instead he went the opposite direction. First to Joppa, and then he paid to get on a ship to Tarshish. And he set sail for Tarshish. And what do you know? God has a way of getting his way because, well, he's God. And so God sends a storm onto the ship on which Jonah is in which Jonah is sleeping. Jonah, interestingly enough, is sleeping in the belly of the ship. And God sends a storm, and the sailors all cry out to their own gods. The captain of the ship comes and wakes up Jonah, and Jonah ends up bearing witness to God. And the whole ship ends up coming to faith, which is amazing. We talked about the way that God does that. He uses even our sin to bring about his purposes. And we left off Jonah 1:16. Jonah had been thrown overboard. And this is where we are going to pick up the story here. Jonah chapter 1, verse 17, and then on into chapter 2. So we're going to pick it up right here. And the Lord appointed, so it's the Lord who does it. What does he do? He appoints.
Mike, can you make it any bigger like you did last week?
Oh, yeah. I'll make it bigger.
There you go. A little bit bigger? Great. That's much better. Thank you.
All right. Actually, here, let's try this. I'll go sideways. Horizontal.
That's better.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you.
The Lord appoints a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Oh man, there is a lot that we can say here. So let's just start with the most obvious observations. It is the Lord who appoints the fish. The Lord does it. Okay. Despite what our children's Bibles tell us, it's a fish. Maybe it's a whale, maybe it's not a whale. And it swallows Jonah. And Jonah is in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Just in the last chapter, Jonah was in the belly of a boat running from God. And now he is in the belly of a fish. And how long is he there? 3 days and 3 nights. Let's state the obvious. God can change everything in 3 days and 3 nights. God will change the entire course of history over the course of 3 days. And here he's going to change the heart of a hard-hearted servant in 3 days and in 3 nights. Now, when we're studying the Bible, it is always good to ask wondering questions. This is one of the things my friend Anne, our kids director, is always talking about. How do we ask wondering questions? And so here's the question that I found myself asking in Jonah 1, verse 17 is, I wonder what it might have been like to be Jonah in the belly of a fish for 3 days and 3 nights. The text doesn't tell us, but asking this question will help us enter into the text in a new way. And as we do that, perhaps it will draw out new applications for us as we enter into the story. So let's think for just a moment about what the belly of a fish might have been like, because it's in the belly of the fish that Jonah becomes who God has called him to be. Okay, so what might it have been like to be in the belly of a fish? Certainly confined. It would have been cramped. Even if it's a huge fish, it would have been cramped. It would have been dark, for sure. Without a doubt, it would have been stinky. It would have been gross, slimy, wet, uncomfortable. It would have smelled. It would have felt confining, almost like a prison cell, or even, dare I say it, a tomb. It would have been obscure out of the way. None of the sailors know that he's there. Nobody knows that he's there. It's just him and the fish and God. Out of the way. Frankly, it's kind of the opposite, isn't it? The unattractive opposite of everything that Jonah had set out for. He's going running to the glamorous Tarshish. And he finds himself, instead of in this expansive new horizon with new possibilities, in the dark, stinky confinement of the belly of a fish. I wonder what Jonah might have felt in that moment. Maybe he felt a little bit of self-righteousness at first, or bitterness. He might have felt some chagrin, like, well, I guess I deserve this. He might have felt uncertain, afraid, hopeless. Maybe he felt grateful. He's alive after all. And probably over the course of those 3 days, felt all of them. This past summer, I was on a sabbatical and I went on a backpacking trip by myself for 3 days and 3 nights. I hiked up and down mountains by myself in silence for 3 days and 3 nights. And I can tell you, I felt the gamut of emotions. Because of course I do. Of course I did. That's what happens when you're left by yourself and God for any period of time. Now we're going to jump briefly from observation to interpretive and even application question just for a moment. I just want to tease this. Where have you experienced your own places of confinement or trial? Because it's out of these places, and it's in these places, if we'll let them be so, that we become who God has called us to be. That's what happens to Jonah. He's in this place of confinement and trial. We're going to see repentance. It's uncomfortable. It's unknown. He has no way of imagining what's ahead of him. He's just left with himself and God, and it's in this place of trial and unknown and darkness and stink that God meets him and transforms him. And if we stop and think, we've all experienced those places before, haven't we? Now let's look briefly here at his prayer. How does Jonah pray? It says, then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. That's changed. He was running from God here just a moment ago, from the belly of the fish, saying. Now, it doesn't say when Jonah prayed. We don't know if he prayed the whole time. We don't know if this is just before. We don't know, but this is what he prayed. I called out to the Lord out of my distress. Now, this is how Jonah's feeling. He's feeling distress. And he answered me. We don't know how he answered. Out of the belly. Wow, we've seen that word before, so we're going to repeat that of Sheol. I cried and called out, and God heard him. God hears and answers. For you cast me into the deep. Oh, Jonah knows that God did it. Into the heart of the sea. The flood surrounded me. This sounds a little bit like Noah, doesn't it? We've heard that word before. It's God who did it here. For you cast me. Your waves, your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. So we see a little hope right here. I'm driven away. This is passive. Even though maybe he was driven away because of his own actions. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. We've got this repetition of language. Passed over, up here, closed in, surrounded, wrapped. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. It sounds like a jail. Yet you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. This hasn't happened yet. You notice that? He's praying this in the belly of the fish in faith. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. This is faith. This is faith. Now those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. This is a phrase that turns up over and over again in the Bible, but there's a transition word. I, with a voice of thanksgiving, really? Will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. What has he vowed? I don't know. We don't know. Doesn't tell us. But then it ends with the declaration, salvation belongs to the Lord. And then the prayer ends. We've got a break. I always try to make a note when there's a change in scene or a change in tone. And then we've got verse 10. The Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out onto dry. That word is great. Vomited Jonah out onto dry land. And then we've got another break, don't we? Right there. Now, do you notice here we've got this prayer in the middle, and there's a little bit of a bookend. In the beginning, the fish swallows Jonah, and then the end, it vomits him out. I imagine the belly of the fish being kind of gross, and then here in verse 10, vomit that is kind of gross. And both times it's the Lord who does it. The Lord appointed the fish. The Lord spoke to the fish. And in the middle, we've got this prayer. And this prayer has a rhythm to it, doesn't it? It's kind of back and forth. If you observe that, it's kind of back and forth between God and him and God's salvation and remembering and faith and hope and almost despair about his current circumstances, and it's all wrapped up in there. And it's kind of a significant prayer, isn't it? At least it seems like it, because what ends up happening at the end of the prayer is Jonah ends up on dry land. He's no longer in a storm, no longer in the belly of a fish, but now he's in dry land with a new opportunity. There's there's certainly an awful lot in that prayer that we could spend some time discussing, but here's what I want to do with that prayer instead tonight, because this is really cool. Now, if you have a study Bible, or if you're looking at a Bible online, there will be footnotes to this text. There will be a lot of footnotes and a lot of cross references. So check this out. Okay. I'm going to minimize Zoom. Do you see this right here? This is my Bible app. This is what I use to study the Bible. We've got a cross reference right here. The very first verse of his prayer, X. Oh, okay. So the first line of the prayer, verse 2, we've got a cross reference to Psalm 3:4. We've got a cross reference to Psalm 121. We've got a cross reference to Lamentations 3:55. In the next line, we've got a cross reference to Psalm 118, verse 5, and Lamentations 3:5 and 6. Then in the third verse of chapter 2, we've got a cross reference to Psalm 88, verse 6, Psalm 88, verse 7, Psalm 42, verse 7. In the fourth verse of Jonah 2, we've got a cross reference to Psalm 31, verse 22. In the fifth verse of chapter 2, we've got a cross reference to Lamentations 3:54 and Psalm 69, verse 1. In the eighth verse, we've got a cross reference to Psalm 31, verse 6, Jeremiah 2:5, Jeremiah 2:13. In the ninth verse of chapter 2, we've got cross reference to Psalm 50:14, Hosea 14:2, Psalm 3, verse 8. Here's what I want to say about that. There's a couple things now that we can do with these cross references. All right. We could Go and study all of them. And that would be well worth it. And it would provide all sorts of valuable insight. Okay. Or we could also just observe that every single line of Jonah's prayer isn't his own. None of them are his own. This is not Jonah's prayer. And friends, this, I think, is significant. The observation is just that Jonah is quoting the Psalms and Lamentations and the prophets liberally. But here's the question I want to pose. What does that tell us about Jonah? And what does it tell us about the way that Jonah prays? Cross-references in general can reveal all sorts of different things. They can help our general understanding. They can provide special insight. They can keep us from missing the mark too badly in our own interpretation and application. They can help us to see the larger thing going on in the text. And these cross-references in Jonah 2 do all of that. But in this study, I want to focus on how they teach us to pray. Here's the obvious observation. Jonah knew the prayer books of the Bible. Jonah knew the Psalms. Jonah knew Lamentations. And when he's in his moment of confinement, when he is in the belly of a fish, when he's dealing with trial and stink and hardship and the consequences of his own fleeing from God, he prays the prayers that he knows. He prays the Psalms. He prays the Lamentations. What's so interesting is he doesn't just pray one psalm, though. He prays a dozen of them. The Psalms and Lamentations don't stifle his creativity in his prayer life. Rather, they give it form. So that in his moment of distress, in his moment of confinement and trial, because Jonah knows the Psalms and the Lamentations, these prayers that have stood the test of time, showed him how to pray. It gave his prayers form. There's a couple quotes here. Eugene Peterson spends a chapter unpacking this in his book, Under the Unpredictable Plant, and I just want to draw a few quick quotes, which I'll drop in the chat for us later here, that help us understand this a little bit. This is what Peterson writes. He says, our culture presents us with forms of prayer that are mostly self-expression, pouring ourselves out to God as we feel the need and have the occasion. Such prayer is dominated by a sense of self. But prayer, Peterson writes, mature prayer is dominated by a sense of God. Prayer rescues us from a preoccupation with ourselves and pulls us into adoration of and pilgrimage to God. The Psalms are the cemetery in which our Lord the Spirit leads us to get out of ourselves, to rescue our prayers from self-absorption, and to set us on the way to God responsiveness. He continues, prayer, which we often suppose is truest when most spontaneous, the raw expression of our human condition without contrivance or artifice, shows up in Jonah when he is in the rawest condition imaginable as learned. Jonah's prayer in Jonah chapter 2, and this is what all these cross-references show us, that Jonah's prayer is a learned prayer. That knowing the forms of the Psalms, the words of the Psalms and the Lamentations, it doesn't stifle his creativity, but it gives his prayer in his moment of distress form and structure. Peterson continues, there is no lack in us of the impulse to pray, and there is no scarcity of requests to pray. Desire and demand keep the matter of prayer before us constantly. So why, Peterson asks, are so many lives prayerless? Simply because the well is deep and you have nothing to draw with. We need a bucket. We need a container that holds water. Desires and demands are a sieve. We need a vessel suited to lowering desires and demands into the deep well of God's presence and word and bringing them to the surface again. Peterson concludes the Psalms are such a bucket. Jonah, in his moment of distress, he does pray his own prayer, but it's a prayer that's formed by the Psalms and the Lamentations. That's what gives him structure. That's what teaches and shows him how to pray. Now that's where we're going to pause today for Jonah chapter 2. And I'm going to share briefly some questions for discussion here, because there are two primary themes in chapter 2 here. We see this. We've got the bookend, that opening line, which describes the confinement, Jonah's distress. That's the first part. And then we've got the second part, which is the prayer. And so we're going to send you here in just a moment to breakout groups. And here's what I'd like you to consider together. First, if you feel comfortable, share a season of trial or confinement the Lord has used to form you. Maybe you're in it right now, and you just need to reframe it. Like, this is what God is doing in Jonah. He's using 3 days and nights in the belly of a fish to form him, that he might do the work that God has given him to do. For you, what was that season of distress or confinement, and how did God use it to form you? And then second, we've got the prayer in Jonah chapter 2, a prayer that's based on the Psalms and Lamentations. And so here's what I'd like you to consider in your groups. Do you have any experience yourself praying the Psalms or prayers that have stood the test of time? If so, what has that been like for you? Now, we're Anglicans, right? This is a big part of our life and worship together as prayers that have stood the test of time. The Psalms, man, even more than our prayer book, are those prayers. And how has your prayer life in general been formed by prayers that have stood the test of time? And then I think this lastly is just so important. When you're not sure how to pray, where do you turn? Because I think that that's what's happening here in Jonah chapter 2. Jonah is in way over his head. He's buried deep in the belly of the fish. He doesn't know how to pray. He doesn't know where to turn. And so he prays the prayers that he was taught to pray. I'll close briefly with a story. Maybe I've shared this before in a sermon or something. I'm not sure. But when I was a young youth pastor, I was a youth pastor at a Presbyterian church, and I was 23 years old, and I was pulling together a confirmation class for the first time. And the elder board, I went to the elder board to present what my plan was for confirmation for the teenagers. And what I proposed was that I would walk the teenagers through the Apostles' Creed. This seemed to make sense to me. At 23, this is the foundation of what we believe. Let's just start here. I'll teach the teenagers the Apostles' Creed, the what, the why, the when, the where. I'll ask their questions. We'll walk through it, and this will prepare them for confirmation. And I'll never forget, one of the elders asked me this question. She said, well, why do our young people need the Apostles' Creed? And I was flabbergasted. I never thought in a Presbyterian church I would ever have to defend teaching the Apostles' Creed to somebody. But she said, like, well, why can't you just teach them John 3:16 and of their Bible verses? Why do you need the creed? And I didn't have an answer. And so the next morning, I was commuting at this time to seminary, and I was living and working in San Diego, commuting to seminary up in Pasadena, near LA. And I was at the train station 6 a.m. to catch my train up for class. And I called my mom. And I said to my mom, I said, Mom, why did you teach me the Apostles? Like, why did you have me memorize the Apostles' Creed as a child? Like she did. I said, why didn't you just have me memorize John 3:16 and Romans 3:23 and call it a day? And I'll never forget, my mom paused, and she said to me, she said, well, I think at the time maybe I was reading a lot of Dostoevsky or something, and I found myself thinking, if you were ever to end up in like a Siberian gulag, like a Siberian prison or something, I would want you to have something more to hold on to than just John 3:16. And so that's why I started teaching you things like the Apostles' Creed, which says something amazing about my mother. But gosh, is that not Jonah's experience? Jonah's in Siberia, in the belly of a fish, but he's got this deep well to draw from because he knows the prayer book of the Bible. He knows the Psalms. He knows the Lamentations. And so in his moment of distress, he's got a bucket from which he can draw from as he engages with God. That's where we're going to stop for now. Molly, if you would be so kind as to send our friends to breakout groups. I'll sit tight for a little while. If as soon as you're done in your breakout groups, feel free to go. You don't have to come back to the main. We're done for the night after you do the breakout groups. But if you'd like to come back and chat a little bit, I will stick around. I'm happy to discuss further. And thank you so much for coming, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. The little dialogue box is going to pop up on your screen, and you just click yes or enter. I can't remember what it says. If you have any problems.